shortly.
Order, and welcome to today's session of the Transport Select Committee, where we continue our pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft rail reform bill. Before we get going, just for our records, could I ask each of you just to state your name and organisation, please?
Yeah. Professor Matthew Campbell-Hill, Chair of DIPTAC, Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee.
Thank you.
I'm Ben Curtis. I'm the Head of External Affairs at Campaign for Better Transport.
I'm Alex Robertson. I'm the Chief Executive at Transport Focus.
Thank you. Welcome all, and we're very grateful to you for giving us your time and opinions this morning. If I could start to ask each of you a very general question. It's often claimed an ambition for this rail reform process is to put the interests of the passenger at the heart of the decision-making and delivery process. Very briefly, do you think the bill, as it's currently drafted, would do that? Start with Professor Campbell-Hill.
Thank you, Chair. I think a key part of it is that if you look at the 1993 Railways Act, there was no provision in there for having any due regard to passengers, and especially with regard to accessibility. So that is certainly a key starting point here, is it does pay regard to accessibility for passengers. I think, though, it is important to note that this is primary legislation, and a lot of when we think about passenger needs, and especially disability, and therefore the accessibility for disabled people, we've got to consider the heterogeneity of the disabled population and the wide difference. And of course, if that is changing all the time, and what is available to disabled people to enable them. And I think primary legislation might not be the place to get too specific, because it can be slow to respond, and actually we want to be able to respond quickly to opportunities, would be my first part. And just to add on to that as a slight caveat, something I note is that it's very easy to think of the disabled population as about 20% of the population. Well, it's not. It's everyone, because at some point in your life, you are disabled. Every single person. Whether it's only when you start off as a child, where you have to be carried around, or you are wheeled around, and therefore you have your first wheelchair, or whether it's transient because you injured yourself, or you're poorly, or it's the later stages of life and you've succumbed to illness or other issues, or actually you are with someone who's disabled. You're a carer, you're a friend, you're a colleague, but you're with them. You have the same restrictions on you as they do. So I think from that regard, at this point, it is certainly moving forward from the original.
Thank you. Well, I want to come to the sort of secondary powers in a moment, but Ben, if you're opening...
I think from our perspective, looking at the bill, I think, the plan for Great British Railways as it was envisioned in the Williams plan will be good for passengers. I think that, the current fragmented system is just evidently not working for passengers. And I think the concept of centralisation in the name of cohesion can only really be a good thing. I think, currently, geography determines your service patterns, the cost of your tickets, and the quality of service. And I think that evidently needs to change. And whilst there are financial realities that will underpin the railway, we're certain that the establishment of an integrated rail body is a good idea and ultimately good for passengers.
Thank you. Alex?
Yes, I think it is good. I think we know from passengers what they want. They want a more reliable, punctual service. They want better value for money. They want to get a seat when they get on the train. They want a more frequent service, and they want to be kept informed on their delays. There are things that passengers repeatedly tell us that they want. And this bill creates a better environment for which that can happen. So line up track and train planning, get the incentives right. But I think it's going to be a lot more than the legislation that delivers what those passenger priorities are. Good management and leadership is absolutely crucial, getting the right people into the industry in the right positions, getting the culture right, so we've got a real hard customer focus driven through the industry. So a lot more to come, and this is just one, I think, important part of the jigsaw, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the other pieces later.
Thank you. And that leads me on neatly to my next question. We've had some concerns expressed that the GBR may become Network Rail 2.0, particularly because the sort of corporate vehicle, if you like, is the Network Rail infrastructure body. How concerned are you about that happening, that it doesn't change the culture in the railways?
I understand the concern that people might have, and you could argue that it's easier to create a new culture in an entirely new organisation. I don't think it's particularly a problem, though. I think it's worth saying, and I'm sure you'll have had evidence from Network Rail themselves, that they see creating a new culture in the IRB as being absolutely critical. I think it's about the right people and getting the right leadership in and getting the IRB having the sufficient sort of clarity of direction and purpose and how it's set up, but then the operational freedom to go on and then deliver with this new culture. So I don't have a problem. I think it's a sensible, pragmatic way of moving forward. It is obviously worth saying that we can't, if we wait for change to happen and the legislation to come in, and passengers right now want a better service. So getting the right management and culture set up to drive those improvement forwards, I think, is crucial. I don't think is hindered by having by the arrangements in the legislation.
Yeah. Matt, do you share those views? Ben first.
Sorry, Chair. Yeah, I think we broadly do agree. I mean, I think it's the logistically easiest thing to do is to kind of designate Network Rail Infrastructure Limited as the IRB. And obviously, Andrew Haynes has made a big song and dance of saying that he doesn't want to create a Network Rail 2.0, but I think it's important to make sure that the same cultures and practices and focus on engineering is not taken forward to the new IRB, whether that be needed in primary legislation or in the licence of the business plan afterwards.
Thank you. And Matt?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I again broadly agree. For me, part of it was thinking about a lot of what you heard in this committee throughout the latter half of last year, especially around the difficulties of regulation, difficulties of enforcement, and I think that, and the difficulties around service, and a lot of uncertainty. We may well come on to that later today. Here's a chance to revamp all of that and bring it into one system that I think would hopefully enable a lot clearer path for everyone included here.
Thank you. And another concern that's been reported to us is the reserved powers of the Secretary of State to intervene. Now, while it's entirely appropriate that the Secretary is ultimately responsible to Parliament and the country for it, there is a concern that these reserved powers could stop it being an independent body. How concerned are you about that? Go to Alex first. Yeah.
So I do think it's important that, it's a very large amount of public money that we're talking about, that the Secretary of State should be able to set the strategic direction and priorities for the new body. And I can understand why directions and guidance are potentially useful too beyond that. I think it's a question of how they're exercised in practice and the transparency around that. I think there is a good degree of consensus that the operational management now needs to come out of the Department for Transport and sit with the IRB and with the right people driving the right culture, the right customer-focused culture in the IRB, then they should be able to get on and do their job. But I can completely see it's a very large amount of public money why the Secretary of State would reserve some powers of directions and guidance.
Would you want to see the bill amended in any way to, create some framework or set out the ways in which the Secretary of State could intervene? Or are you happy with the drafting as it is? Happy
with the drafting. I think some sort of transparency about the directions and guidance when they're issued will be important, but no, I wouldn't suggest any changes to the drafting.
Okay. And Ben?
Yeah, I think it was Andy Bagnall who said in the last oral evidence session that I think there's a kind of broad agreement across the industry that the Secretary of State's going to need powers to set up the terms of the licence and the kind of the teething pains that will occur when we move towards Great British Railways. But I think these powers do need to be kind of limited when the IRB is up and running. I think, the reason that we're here and discussing this bill is, one of the things that's not working on our railways at the moment is there are too many decisions being held up by the DfT and other stakeholders, as obviously they have too much oversight of aspects of the railways. And I think, although there's some oversight is necessary, I agree with Alex that, these powers need to be applied, kind of judiciously to to make sure the IRB can have space to breathe, so to speak.
Matt, do you share that view?
Yes, yeah. I think there's always a flip side to when you create an opportunity of oversight, like we have this, which is what you're raising here. What would be the concerns? What are the opportunities? Now, a clear opportunity is, as I already raised earlier, actually, if there's a change or a change is needed, actually that's quite an opportunity to enable enforcement. And again, coming back to what we were hearing last year about the lack of enforcement or the difficulties people are having, actually enabling someone at that level to be able to say, this needs to change, this is how it needs to change, and it needs to happen now. That's really important.
Thank you. Carl, you wanted to...
Thank you, Chairman. I was hoping that you were being devil's advocate with some of your questions just there, but with the three of you and your answers, although I like to hear some of them, I'm probably going to question Ben more than the other two, if you don't mind, but feel free to chip in. Surely you'll agree, Ben, that whoever the Secretary of State is, they're the elected person who represents the country and transport within the government. Nobody wants anything like COVID and lockdowns to happen again. But should there be some emergency planning or some emergency contingency, then there would have to be something in the regulations that would allow a Secretary of State to step in and help or assist, which is maybe coming to where Matt was coming from, the whole rail sector, rather than say, it's nothing to do with me, Gov, you've got the powers and the reasons and whatever else and the decisions to be made. Those are the things that I'm looking at, and I worked within the SRA where it really wasn't an independent body, because everything went through the Department of Transport and then to the Treasury. Of course. You'd hope where we are going to at this point, which is coming to your point, Alex, is that there is proper autonomy and the right people are in the right roles to run the railways as they should be, customer focused, basically.
Yeah, I think obviously, there needs to be a level of the Secretary of State being able to, kind of set out the kind of outline through the business plan of what needs to happen. But I do think that there needs to be a level of independence. And as I say, it's not day-to-day operations of running the railway. I'm no legislative expert, but it's, basically our position that we think that the IRB needs to have space to breathe in order to get the job done, essentially.
No, I'd agree with that. Anything to add? I'd agree with that.
Not for me.
Thank you, Chairman.
Graham, if I could turn to you next.
Thanks, Chair. I was interested in your answers earlier, Matt, about the 1993 Act and the fact that the interests of passengers and disabled passengers weren't even considered. What role should passengers and organisations like yours have in shaping the policies of the integrated rail body's business plan?
Thank you. There's a very key part, if I may, if I focus a bit on the accessibility side.
I wanted to, because very recently a constituent of mine, Jill Cole, contacted me, and she was having a day out with her disabled nephew who's in a wheelchair, and we only have an hourly service from Seaham to Newcastle. It consists of 2 carriages. They were denied access on 3 occasions. They waited 2 hours. Little boy was in tears. It doesn't seem to me that the interests of disabled passengers, either with the physical infrastructure, ramps and lifts, or with the personnel through Northern Assist or Passenger Assist, is working properly.
So, I'm very sorry to hear that. Unfortunately, I couldn't say to you anything along the lines of I'm glad that's a one-off, because it's not. It's nowhere near it. And we heard this. I say we because I went through all of the sessions that you were in last year on this, and what you heard time and again are systemic failures, and that our systems, our rail system especially, is seen as complex, inefficient, unreliable, discriminatory. Was the big word that came up for me, and there is a real need for some kind of provision, legal provision, to protect people, enable them to do it, and get disabled passengers to get on. So
it's not happening now, but how is it going to happen under the new structure?
Yeah, so I think a key part for me has to be from this point onwards, and actually DIPTAC has already been involved in all of this work up until now. We shouldn't be looking at having conversations about how do we make this thing that already exists accessible. It should have been baked in. It has to happen from the start. And I have yet to be shown an example where an accessibility improvement has been made that has made it worse for anyone else. I think that's in any area of travel or any mode of travel. So that's what we need to do. It appears that that is being baked in at this point with the due regard to. What we would like to see at DIPTAC is much more clarity on exactly what that says. So essentially picking on what Ben was saying a moment ago, what does that actually look like? And of course that's not going to be done at this point. That's the work that is to come.
Thanks. I wonder if I might ask Mr. Robertson. The draft bill broadens the powers of your organisation to allow it to raise issues with other bodies. I'm thinking about the Office of Road and Rail in particular. And I mean, on this, the example of the ticket office closure, for example, when the Rail Delivery Group brought forward proposals to close the ticket offices. What would you think about the bills, the draft bill's proposals in relation to the powers that your organisation will have?
Yeah, so you're right, it's slightly broadens our powers in terms of who we can raise issues with, but broadly we keep the same functions and not so dissimilar to now. We're an advocate for consumer rights and for passengers. We're not a regulator. I think we're really clear about that. So we're not suggesting that we should have enforcement powers. And I think understanding, we work closely with the OR at the moment. Their role would obviously change once the IRB is set up, and we would need to think, and I think the white paper suggested it seems sensible to me that we would revisit the MOU that we have with the OR, so we're really clear what we do. I think one of the things that you will have heard a lot of evidence on is the need for absolute clarity, so you don't get two different kind of regulators. So we're not a regulator. We need to be very clear how we would relate to the OR under the new relationship once it's set up.
I can see that the drafts bill is giving you powers to make representations, to be consulted. But you won't have any teeth. I'm thinking of a practical example. If you think the closure of ticket offices is a bad idea, and you say that, and then the Secretary of State or the ORR decides to do it anyway, is that a good thing?
So the ticket office closure was a very particular one-off power that doesn't really relate generally to what we do. No, we're quite comfortable with the idea that we are a consumer watchdog who are very passionate about what the customers want, can investigate, go anywhere, do anything, look at any issue that is different to a regulator. A regulator will be have to operate within the bounds of the regulation. We do say it's in our evidence that we are suggesting a small change to the legislation where we would bring our responsibilities in line or powers in line with what we have in relation to the bus network, where people are required to respond to us. In practice, we don't tend to.
I was just going to ask that. I was trying to tease that. So not just the powers to be consulted and to make representations, but to receive a response from the Secretary of State or whoever.
Yeah, I mean, in practice, we've tended not to have an issue. But actually, it would give us a little bit more teeth, as you say. And bring us in line with the powers in relation to bus network, which are relatively recently reviewed.
Yeah, I think there's not much more I'd add to that. I think it seemed a smart move to allow Council Focus to make direct representations even to the IRB and to the ORR. I mean, that seems like the obvious thing to do, but I wouldn't have much more to say. I mean, we're not a statutory body. We don't have, we don't feed back to government in that way.
Matt, broad agreement there?
Yes, of course, we feed back to government in a very different way, so we have direct access. And I think, arguably, under this, under GBR, you wouldn't have the issue around ticket offices that came up. The way that came about, it wouldn't happen. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Just before I turn to Gavin, Alex, one supplementary. On the powers that you have with regard to buses, is there a time frame that the response has to be made, or is it open-ended?
It's open-ended, and we haven't suggested exactly what the time frame should be in relation to rail, but some time frame equivalent to what other public bodies would need to respond would seem sensible to me.
Thank you. Gavin.
Thanks so much, Chair. If I can direct my questions to you, Matt, I suppose it's a continuation to the start of my college questions, but I'll start with a more general one. In terms of the draft bill, clearly it proposes to expand DIPTAC's role to advise both the IRB and the Secretary of State. How do you anticipate this actually working in practice?
So, it's one that we do have to keep thinking about and have to look at closely with them. If you look at through the explanatory notes on the draft bill, it says that there were conversations with DIPTAC about this, and I believe they were, but it was unfortunately before my time. There was felt there was no particular resource needed or anything like that. I think where I'm sitting now, I don't know what the resource needs are going to be. And I think that's something that we really have to come back to. What's the clarity? What's the specifics that are going to be asked? And do they stack up? Because it's quite important to understand that DIPTAC is a very small organisation. We're a small committee, and everyone working on the committee is working part-time for DIPTAC. So in order to enable them to be able to give the right advice and pay due attention, we need to ensure that we've got the staffing to do that and the time to do that. And we do rely heavily on the organisations outside. We are really fortunate in this country to have some fantastic organisations like my colleagues here, and like Transport for All, and huge numbers who are brilliant at making it understood what conversations need to be had, and we do rely on them as DIPTAC as well as our own knowledge. So
I was just going to be clear, you'll be engaging with those groups as you work out your role, etc., to show you as wide a range of voices as possible. I suppose that takes me on. Do you think the role envisaged for DIPTAC within the draft bill as it currently stands is a sufficient safeguard for accessibility?
It's part of it. And you wouldn't want to rely on a small committee like DIPTAC for all of it. And the important part is to ensure that it's not wholly reliant going forward. So it's about ensuring that DIPTAC is engaged over the coming years so that you get clear regulations in place. Now, as some of you may know, I've spent quite a lot of the last few years working across different regulators. And regulation only works, in my mind, when it's clear so that you can actually act on it. And I think if we can work to do that, then that will help set some of that in place and enable other parts. So you wouldn't ever want to be wholly reliant on one small organisation, no. But as a part of the whole, yes, I think it's an important part of the whole. Yeah.
Of course, one of the reasons I ask, and I mean you'll be aware that DIPTAC have come under a bit of criticism for the submission thus far and efforts. Do you think you have the confidence of the wider disabled community in terms of the accessibility requirements that will be within the bill or the face of the bill moving forward? Or is that something you think you need to work on?
It's something that we definitely need to work on, and we do continue to. So when I started the role, beginning of last year, one of the first things I came in with very clear about is we need to increase the public awareness and understanding of who we are, what we do, and what we are doing. So as you will hopefully see from over the past 14 months, we've published 34 documents. The previous year, I think DIPTAC published 3, and the year before that, I think it published 7. Those are sort of numbers you were looking at before. There wasn't the ability to have the transparency. So now you can see our minutes, not only of our main meetings, but our working group meetings. I thought it was very important that people can see what we're talking about. Obviously, minutes are different. And of course, the key bit here is we are not a lobbying organisation. We are, in the same way as the non-executive director role, we are the critical friend. We are the fool to King Lear. We are the person who is there to be able to have the frank conversations. And I think really important about those conversations with your friends, with your colleagues, is they're the people that you can ask the stupid questions to. You need a feedback system where you can ask the stupid questions and people can give you the true unfiltered answer. So that is not understood by many. Do we have the confidence of the public? Well, I'm very pleased to note that we launched our recruitment exercise for taking on new members. There was a pause on it because of the issues around COVID for many people. We had over 200 applications. I believe I'm right in saying DFT has never had so many applications for a role. So I think we've got the confidence there, and we're in the process of doing that. And the final thing to say, if you look through our minutes of last year, you will see I and other members of DIPTAC were heavily involved in discussing ticket offices. And we obviously would have had a very clear route of what was needed around there, and there was a clear outcome.
If I could, you referenced in answer to Mr. Morris, you referenced the have regard to. So, Transport for All, for instance, have said that they have regard to the accessibility requirements of persons who are disabled falls very far short of providing the necessary legal framework to enforce tangible improvements. Would you agree, and would you agree with their assertion that we need to see either on the face of the bill and secondary legislation the proper safeguards put on or written down rather than this have regard to rather vague statement that's currently drafted? And if so, what would you change it to? If you were writing it yourself, what would you change it to?
That's the problem.
I'm giving you the power.
But it's actually something I've asked myself. What is the right wording? Because I understand what Transport for All have said there. And again, going back to what we heard last year, these are real concerns. What does it actually mean? What's that clarity? I think for me it comes back to, I don't think the primary legislation is the place for it to have anything else, because where does the specificity stop? What do we get into? The problem is that second part of your question for me personally is, what are the words to replace it? I don't know what the words to replace it are for this bill.
I think the problem, speaking personally, I'm not speaking for the groups, is I've been in this place for nearly 9 years, and when we hear we don't want to see that too specific, we don't need to see that in the face of the bill, that will be dealt with in secondary legislation. Then lo and behold, when secondary legislation appears, either isn't dealt with or isn't dealt with anywhere near sufficiently. So I do take your point, but I think that's the understandable concern of groups. So I suppose with that in mind, my last question is the bill as it stands a missed opportunity to tackle the long-standing accessibility issues within the rail sector that we all know exist?
I don't think it is. No, I don't think it's a missed opportunity. I think because mainly this particular bill is about starting the process to enable what is going to be the work that will enable us to do that. And that's why I get stuck with the previous question that embittered. So what do we change those words to? So no, I don't think it's a missed opportunity. I think the really important work starts now on this.
Okay, thanks.
Sarah.
Thank you, Chair. In December, the government announced that it wasn't going to pursue a centralised ticketing system run by GBR. Is that a concern that the panel has?
Yeah, I'll start on that one. So we know what the public want. They want simple, easy to understand fares. They want it to be able to get it in a variety of different ways. They want it to be clear if any conditions are attached to those fares. And they want a guarantee that they've got the best fare. centralised ticketing database would have been one way that might have helped with that. I don't think it's critical for it. We haven't actually, if you ask the public what they want, it's those three things that I said that they will tend to say, rather than give me a central ticketing database or website. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, what's that the change you described pre-Christmas. But what I would want to see in fares reform, which is absolutely critical, is reduce the complexity of the fares, make them much, much simpler, and be confident that when you're going to buy a fare from X to Y, A to B, you are confident that you have got the lowest fare possible. That's what needs to happen. There's different ways of achieving it.
And do you then believe that this bill addresses that in any way, shape or form?
I think it's the same issue that we were just talking about in relation to accessibility. The legislation gives you the framework to create the IRB, to get there, a single organisation that brings together track and train, get the planning right, get the business planning right, make sure that you've got customer priorities in there from the beginning. You can do all that. Is the legislation the way to solve some of those issues? Personally, I don't think so.
Yeah, I would concur with that view. I mean, I could talk until the cows come home about the broken fares and ticketing system that we have, and the 55 million different fares that are on sale. But I think there should be a broad third party market for ticket sales, so innovation can take place in the sector. But I would probably defer to your next speakers to talk about fares and ticketing, who will be able to talk more about the kind of centralisation of ticketing and the government and the opposition's view on that.
So you don't think it's a mistake that this isn't on the face of the bill then?
No, I don't think so. As I said, I think that needs to be dealt with in secondary legislation is my understanding. I think just getting the kind of basics right and the broad framework right is the most important thing, rather than going into minute detail.
I agree, and especially after the issues we heard last year, and it's already been brought up about the different tickets that you can get at different areas and the specialties, and then especially you add in the issues around accessibility. Yeah, this isn't the place for it. Certainly needs to be dealt with, though.
Thank you, and as you alluded to, we will be exploring the ticketing issue further with our next panel. Graham, back to you.
Thanks. We touched on the role of the ORR. Do you agree with the suggestion that the role of the ORR should be expanded, so it's not just involved in the oversight of safety and competition? I wonder, Alex, if I might ask you, because you touched on it previously.
Yeah, so I think the role of the ORR will clearly change when the IRB is created.
Should it involve the views of passengers? Should it have some responsibility for the passengers' perspective as well as competition and safety?
Yeah, so I think we've got sort of slightly different roles. I think we are in a position where we can give really clear advocacy in relation to what passengers want. I think the ORO's role as a regulator does need to be different, and it needs to be grounded in the licence and the arrangement that the IRB is set up for. I know you took evidence from them a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about a whole system regulation, and I think they will need to think about what that looks like in practice. It's slightly down the line, and it does depend on the operating model that's set up, what the relationship is between the IRB and the transport operating companies. And of course there'll be some parts of the network that sit outside the IRB's control as well. So I think there's a lot to be worked through there. And I think a good dialogue with the ORO, I mentioned before, the white paper and an MOU with them, I think that's right. I do think I've said this before, and it isn't so much for the legislation, but really baking in a laser-like customer focus all the way through, from setting up from the right people at the top to the metrics that are set up to measure performance, the priorities of sectors. So all of those things need to be there in the foundation of the IRB, and some of that, like I was saying, that's come a few times, will need to be worked through in the next stage.
Then you were nodding there. So service and quality, should all of that be baked into the ORR's role?
Yeah, we think so. I think it's slightly strange that the ORR will only have responsibility for the track part of bringing track and train in-house. And I think this would be quite a good opportunity actually to create a kind of unified regulator that encompasses all areas of the integrated rail body. I mean, the integrated rail body is going to be huge. Getting on top of that information that's produced or released is going to be a task in itself. And we'd certainly welcome that idea. I think also one of the things that we felt that was needed in the bill is the ability for the ORR to sanction the integrated rail body if it's failed to meet the obligations as laid out in the business plan. At the moment, there's you can levy fines and penalties on operators when they're not performing, and we don't really understand why that's not being transferred, to this new integrated rail body.
Made a note of that. It's a really good point. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Matt?
Thank you. So actually, for me, this is where it comes back to what we were talking about with Transport for All's quote earlier. I think this is a great opportunity for a stronger, proactive and really enforceable route to accessibility duties. Being able to have those teeth that we've talked about and we heard, and that definitely goes beyond that having regard to phrase, and that's the role of a regulator.
It's not revolutionary, it's simply a continuation of what we have under the current arrangements, but giving them the powers to apply fines and other sanctions.
Yeah, my understanding is it's relatively common practice, not just on that point, but to bring the regulator into track and train. They do it in Germany, they do it in France, they do it in the Netherlands. As I say, I can't speak to being a real expert on rail regulation, but I'm sure there are greater minds who can assess the details and the functionality of how this might work.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. A final question for this panel, I suppose, is an open one. Is there anything else that you would like to see in the bill?
Not for me. I mean, I've come back to a lot. It's a lot of stuff that isn't in the bill that comes next. Get that absolutely right. Get the culture right. Get the leadership right. And also don't wait. Let's crack on as well. The bill is going to create a framework. It's going to bring track and train together. But if we know it's coming, we can start to make some of those changes and some of those more customer-focused interventions even before the change comes into effect.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the key point is to get this bill on the floor of the House of Commons and hopefully passed. I mean, I joined Campbell-Hill Better Transport in September of 2022, and we were talking about the possibility of that going before the floor. We're now, sort of 2 years down the line, and we still haven't seen it. And I would try and keep the bill as streamlined as possible. I think one concern that we mentioned in our report, and I'm afraid my knowledge doesn't extend to talk about this further than just this point, is a point of which was made by a member of our team, is that Network Rail weren't subject to freedom of information requests until 2015. And I think we'd be very keen to ensure that the new body will actually be subject to freedom of information requests. As I say, I don't know much more on that, but it's something that we definitely didn't see in the bill and may need to be covered in primary legislation.
Well, if your organisation has any further points on that, please do write to us with that.
I'd be delighted to.
That detail, Matt.
Thank you. Again, what we heard throughout last year, and I apologise to keep coming back to it, but it was very powerful. Strong sentiments, warm words, voluntary commitments, and strategies that don't translate into real change aren't of comfort. But a coherent action plan with commitment and ring-fenced funding streams and a cross-operator working is the important route forward. And I think this gives us the opportunity to start doing that with the idea of, even though it's only having regard to at the moment, but having accessibility in the passenger baked in from the start is really important.
Thank you all very much indeed for your evidence this morning. And if we could invite the next panel to come forward. Order.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome to our second panel this morning. Again, for our records, could I ask you to state your name and organisation, please?
Good morning, I'm John Davies. I'm Vice President for Industry Relations at Trainline.
Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Cameron Jones and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for SilverRail.
Thank you. We're welcome. We're grateful for your presence and evidence this morning. In the panel, you're both in the audience to hear the first panel, and we touched on the issue of the proposed centralised online ticketing platform, which the government decided not to proceed with last year. Briefly, could you give us your reaction to that change of policy? Mr. Davies, if you could start with you.
I think the first observation is, to some extent, it's possibly a moot point in as far as the current government has decided not to proceed, and the opposition has also shared its intention not to proceed with a centralised retail platform should it be admitted to power. I think our broader reaction, though, to it is that competition in any marketplace is always a positive thing. We have always said that competition in a marketplace is a positive thing. I think the themes that were prominent in our mind was the entrance of a state-backed, vertically integrated monopoly and what that might do to the nature of competition in the retail marketplace. And the provisions around the wider retail market and how that would be structured and regulated effectively in the interests of all participants was something that was top of mind for us, but was never given any great prominence in the thinking around how a centralised retailer would operate in practice.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, your reaction?
Sure. So I think we were shocked, frankly, that it didn't go through in December before Christmas. I actually take a differing opinion to John around the sense of a state monopoly. I think we almost have a monopoly now in ticket retailing, and I think that the introduction of GBR as a retailer would actually provide more competition in retailing, and that would drive more innovation into the market. Frankly, without GBR, I think we would find consumers more confused about rail. Imagine British Airways with no BA.com, or British Telecom, or British Gas with no retail site. There'd have to be a website, but what would they have on that website? Pictures of trains? I think that retailing through GBR is essential to get more people back on trains, providing competition to the third-party retailers. Trainline does a great job of retailing in the UK and in other markets as well, but I think needs competition to drive that innovation. I think if customers are taking trains either branded by the current franchise brands or in the future potentially GBR, and they're going to stations and seeing GBR branding, and they're buying tickets from stations branded GBR or ticket vending machines branded GBR, it would only follow that there should be a GBR website to also retail, otherwise you'd find very confused consumers wondering where they buy their national tickets from. Every country in the world that retails rail has a national website that retails rail. I think it's a real step forward for the UK to do this. That innovation would get more people back onto trains and drive more competition and actually cheaper fares, better service and better innovation. And I think you'd find Trainline and GBR would challenge each other, and more third-party retailers would enter the market and challenge each other to drive a better service.
Thank you. If I could just probe that point a little further. You don't have any concerns that if there was a GBR.com ticket facility, that would just become a monolith and squeeze out competition to the margins?
No, absolutely not. I think there's a strong need for third-party retailers. My background is I've worked in travel technology all my life, and I've worked for Expedia for a number of years before SilverRail. Before that, I worked for a hotel chain. And I see the benefits of this competition between the supplier and their own branded website and intermediaries, pushing each other to drive more innovation and to drive a better service for customers. I think without that, you'll see stifled innovation because you don't have that natural place for people to choose where they prefer to buy tickets. Some people go to BA.com to buy their tickets because they prefer that. A lot of people go to Expedia, lastminute.com, many other retailers who buy the tickets for BA or other airlines. So I think it's quite the opposite. It would encourage competition and it would be a better thing for consumers.
But presumably if there was this centralised platform, there would have to be safeguards that a third-party vendor would have access to all the data, the algorithms and so on.
So as a company, SilverRail powers both rail carriers' own direct websites and also retailers. We power Virgin Trains in the UK, Google uses our data to search for trains, and many others, Seatfrog and other retailers. 100% the same access needs to be provided for all retailers as it is for GBR. GBR should have no advantage over retailers. It should be the same access to fares, the same access to promotions, and that fair playing field needs to be non-discriminatory, needs to be established so that the third-party retailers have a fair chance to compete with GBR.
And as I alluded to, this is not current government policy, but if they did a reverse U-turn and went back to their original proposal to have this, is this something that you would need to see on the face of the bill, or would it wait for secondary legislation or
It absolutely needs to be in primary legislation, and it needs to be a central focus for retail. I disagree with the previous panel that you can't have simplified fares and ticketing without a simplified retailing strategy. And without the face of GBR being online, it's like a cart with no horse. 100% it needs to be in the primary legislation.
Thank you. And Mr. Davies, if I could ask you next, you've in your evidence have said that there should be a specific principles-led duty for the IRB to ensure all rail retail participants are treated on a fair, equal and non-discriminatory basis, and that the ORR should have powers to enforce a level playing field. Can you just talk us through why you think these measures are required?
Sure. So the context here is important, which is that the community of independent retailers, of which there are around 10 or so, and in addition to the different train operating company retailers that exist at the moment, exist in a marketplace, but that marketplace is essentially unregulated at the moment. It is controlled in terms of its entry by Rail Delivery Group, who allocate the licences to be able to retail. But Rail Delivery Group finds itself sometimes conflicted in that role because it is an association of member interests. And so there are occasions where RDG's role as both licensor and essentially competitor, once removed, come into conflict with each other. And this means that at the moment, the kind of themes that Cameron talked about don't always come into play. So we see areas where train operators are acting in ways that are self-preferencing. They withhold certain types of fares for themselves, certain types of products, certain types of features, so that only those things can be done by them, and indeed withhold access to markets. We have been trying for 3 years to expedite the availability of digital season tickets across the industry. It took us 10 years to get the availability of digital mobile tickets across the industry. And these things move much more slowly than they should. And so an effectively operated, structured, governed market, I think, is an important step as we think about a reformed rail industry. The community of retailers now collects approximately half of all passenger income across the industry. And so the participants in that industry need to have the assurance that they can compete and that they can operate fairly and effectively and with stability.
Thank you. And Mr. Jones, do you agree with that?
Yes, I'd echo John's comments. I think that the third-party retailers need to have the same access to full fares and data and promotions, as I said before, as any centralised retailing solution. It creates, as I said, more innovation, more competition, more choice for customers. They can buy tickets where they choose to buy tickets. That's the right thing.
Thank you. Jack.
Thank you, Chair. And firstly to Mr. Davies, in terms of competition, Trainline do have quite a significant market share at the moment, don't they? So do you think there is effective competition happening in the ticketing market?
So I think it's true to say that Trainline is certainly successful, but it is not exempt from the powers of competition by any means. And I've talked already about some of the other independent retailers that are in the market. We have seen in the last year or two the entry of large organisations like Uber into UK Rail. We see really strong global brands like Virgin in UK Rail. And so in the end, in this marketplace, you have to remember that customers have a choice, right? They choose to come to you because of the service or the product that you offer, and that is what differentiates you in the marketplace, because by and large, the prices are homogenous. And so the extent to which Trainline is successful is because it serves customers in a way that customers respond to, and they respond in terms of repeat purchase. But we are kept on our toes by the other participants in the marketplace, and we've talked a little bit about Google. Cameron's mentioned Virgin already, Uber as well. They are all there. C-Trip is another entity that is a retailer in the UK, Chinese-backed state retailer, all have not insubstantial resources that they can bring to bear in this marketplace, and certainly are equipped to compete with Trainline as they are choosing to do.
Mr. Jones, what sort of barriers to entry are there for new entrants or third parties coming into the ticketing market?
Yeah, Jack, it's a good question. I think structurally the commission payments are a challenge or a barrier for new entrants into the market. I think you need to be at significant scale, like Trainline is, to run a profitable rail retailing business. John mentioned these new entrants, and he's right. Uber, big deep pockets, really great competitor, great brand that could get into rail. But I think you heard on, or if you saw Trainline's earnings call just the other day, they haven't even started, they're not a blip on the radar for Trainline right now. Virgin Trains Virgin Trains ticketing is growing significantly, but also struggling. There's a very big gap between Trainline and anyone else because of the cost of entry into the rail ticketing marketplace and the need for scale before you can run a profitable business, and that's a big hill to climb. Hence why I think Trainline has such a good lead and is such a successful business, but it's difficult for anyone to really challenge Trainline currently.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there should be also more options in terms of ticketing to offer different sorts of packages, because at the moment it is very structured, the price is very structured, in terms of adding on other packages and things like that, as you would see within the airline industry, that doesn't really exist at the moment when it comes to rail ticketing, and maybe both of you might want to come in on this. Is there more opportunities to grow that in terms of offering different packages? Maybe Mr. Jones wants to start first.
Yeah, so I think in general, fare simplification would be a good thing. It's as everybody who would speak today, I'm sure would echo those comments. I think simplified fares create an easier to understand system. I think the key thing with retailing is looking at the barriers that we currently have. Paper tickets that you need to print out at ticket vending machines, depending on where you buy your ticket. If you buy a barcode or you buy a train ticket that passes through London, you can no longer access a barcode. It has to be printed on a CCST, a paper ticket. I think being able to retail in stations with barcodes or have the entire network barcode enabled, and I think John would agree with this, it would get more people out of cars into trains, more people out of planes into trains. I think also high street retailing, allowing people to buy tickets from their local corner store, or wherever people shop for or pay the electricity bills or do whatever. So I think it's not just the fares, it's the channels that the tickets are sold in, and trying to digitise as much as possible, but then also have options available for the unbanked or the people that don't use mobile phones or the web, and allow them to go to their corner stores and print out a barcode ticket there and still use the network.
Do you have any further thoughts on that, Mr. Davies?
I would share almost everything that Cameron referred to, and just to build on them a little bit. The advent of digital ticketing in train tickets more broadly has been transformational for the industry, and what we have seen is that where customers use their mobile devices to buy tickets, they then tend to do so more often. And this was a lesson that Transport for London taught us, let's say 15 or even 20 years ago, when Oyster showed that you make it easier for people to buy their travel entitlements, and then people travel more often. And I think unhindered, the industry could really exploit some of the opportunities here. Season tickets could do with reforming in two ways. One is the universal adoption of a common fulfilment standard, which I think we would say would be barcode in the first instance, enables customers to have their regular travel entitlement and to have delay information, platform information, what do I do if things go wrong. The ability to have your travel entitlement in your mobile device is hugely liberating, but still a very, very digitally underexploited
So do you have at the moment as well the flexibility to do discounts and offers and things like that?
The problem with that as an assumption is that retailers, as Cameron has said, are paid currently 5%. That will change to 4.5% as a commission. It's 2% in the seasons market, and those commissions, candidly, even at scale, are challenging to operate in viably. Once you take into account the cost of sale, the payment costs, the fraud costs, costs of customer service, the fulfilment costs, so every time you sell a ticket there's a fulfilment cost to the barcode. all of those things eat all of the commission payments, and therefore you need to look for other ways of monetising what it is that you do in the rail industry. Discounting is therefore not something that can be done by retailers, because we only have 5% of the share of the face value of the ticket to play with. It is something that is done more widely by train operators, who sometimes discount by 10 or 20% or offer cashback type schemes, which is a concern actually in the market that we operate in at the moment, because they are clearly operating outside an economical window of retailing that everybody else is required to operate within. And that is something that a reformed rail industry would need to address, that everybody should operate within the same economic framework, and that's, I think, one of our particular concerns. But more than sort of simple discounting, which I think is quite a blunt tool, if you think about the commuter market, you think about season tickets as being a place where it is known that regular commuters are amongst the slowest to return to travel. So the leisure market has rebounded resoundingly, that the commuter and the business markets are lagging. And yet the season ticket product that is available within UK Rail is a construct that's 40 years old, maybe more. And in today's retail environment, it seems obvious to us that you could entertain relatively simply, if seasons were digitally enabled, the kind of the more you buy, the more you save type product that would eventually get you to the levels of discount of an annual season ticket. But there are relatively few people now in this day and age where people are much more mobile and they change their habits, they change their places of work, they change where they live, who want to commit several thousands of pounds up front to an annual season ticket to get the best discount that's available to them. So without kind of having to move the underlying principles, the way in which seasons are priced too far, you could choreograph the product in a way that was much more effective for today's customers, I think.
I want to also ask you about the development of the IRB's business plan, and do you think that ticket retailers should have some say and involvement in that? Maybe Mr. James wants to go first.
I think that the retailer should be consulted, absolutely, but I think we need to be cautious that we don't run a process which slows down decision making. I think that third-party retailers have a very customer-focused orientation and can provide great feedback into the IRB, into what works for consumers. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration, that it's limited to not slow down process. Secondly, I think there should be full transparency around any of those meetings or any of that feedback, so that everybody in the market is aware of what is being advised, and transparency in the decisions that come out of those processes.
Davies?
Agree with what Cameron said. I think we would like to see a closer connection between what it is that the rail industry is trying to achieve for itself in certain markets, in certain demographics, the commercial goals that it's trying to reach, and the role it sees for retailers in achieving them. And so there is a role for retailers to have dialogue with the future rail industry in the formulation of a business plan. Exactly as Cameron says, that should be transparent. It should not slow processes down. That would be hopeless. I would rather like to think of this as speeding things up. Okay, what is the agenda? What are we trying to achieve? How do we make those things happen? How do we then get amongst it? And then also, how is it held to account if those things aren't delivered? So those things are all important.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Gavin. To you next.
Thanks so much, Chair. If I can briefly build on some of the questions my colleague was asking, I suppose you'd say I'm a regular user of Trainline. Mr. Davies, you said you made a point that obviously because of the constraints of commission, which obviously you both have issues with, for sort of different reasons potentially as well, but buying direct, because of those constraints, and operators have the ability to give kind of higher reductions in fare, etc., it's potentially cheaper than buying for a third party such as yourself. I suppose my point is, surely that's normal. Like if I go to my local takeaway, they're encouraging me to, not that I frequent such places on a regular basis, Chair, but indeed, they encourage you to contact them directly or use their app then perhaps use a food hub or a Uber Eats or other such apps, etc., and you can get a bigger discount on those sites as a result. Surely that's just normal in retail, irrespective of what sector it is.
I think that's true to an extent, but what is problematic is that a train operator, in effect, is utilising its dominance in that market and offering something into the marketplace that is cross-subsidised from the revenue that it takes from the sale of the ticket. So the industry has created for itself an independent retailer market to compete, but the way in which train operators are allowed to compete is compromised by the ability of train operators to cross-subsidise the discounts that they give from the fares that they take. And I think that in an era when we are, I think, aspiring to simplification and cohesion and creating greater certainty in the minds of customers, then orchestrating the fares offer so that it is simpler is one of the themes that has pervaded reform. I think then what differentiates competition is the way in which those things are offered up to customers, the way that they're sold, how they're sold to different demographics and different market segments in different ways, and how they are sold with different adjacencies to other things, as we've seen, Uber do in the marketplace in the last 12 months.
Okay, and previously the Minister had said that essentially the government was agnostic in terms as to the levels of private and public sector involvement. This was around discussions with regard to LNER and operators of last resort, etc., which was obviously slightly different from just the ticket retailing end of the market. Nevertheless, there obviously is a part of the draft bill that asks for an annual report on boosting private sector involvement in the railway, despite that view being given. And do you think the IRB should be required to have a specific section on retail within that requirement? Because at the moment it doesn't. I'll start with you, Mr. Jones, sorry, because I've already...
I think John would probably agree with me and say yes. We think that's great.
I thought you might.
Again, it makes perfect sense to include that section. I think private enterprise within the rail retailing is an incredibly important part of rail retailing. And just to pick up on your question before around pricing, I think that the level playing field needs to have the same access to pricing. But the reality is, as you said, in every other travel vertical you see the same thing. The suppliers are usually trying to do as much as they can to win customers to their own direct channels. But there's a lovely symbiotic relationship between intermediaries and suppliers. The suppliers can see the intermediaries like Trainline as a great customer acquisition tool. If they do a great job on their service, then maybe that customer turns into a direct customer. Maybe that customer wants to shop around again and go back to an intermediary. And this relationship should continue to occur. Intermediaries bring value to suppliers that they can't do themselves, whether it be marketing in other countries, bringing customers that want to buy a hotel and a train together. So I think it's important that the same access to fares is fundamentally the platform that natural competition flows from.
I'll just push back slightly before I come to you, Mr. Davies. Surely the operator, the person providing the service, in this case a rail service, because they're providing the service to the customer, the consumer, the passenger, and all of the far greater overheads and costs that service has than just the ticket retailer, surely they should have that more flexibility to do as they wish with regard to tickets.
Again, it's about filling trains, and most of the trains are not full at the moment. So I think the suppliers need to be sensible about how they utilise all of their channels to try and fill their trains, and that could be through different commission payments for different trains, different times, different products, different markets, different channels. So it's not a blanket approach to retailing. It's about how to be smart about your operation and run a more profitable business. So I think it's.
Okay, back to the question on the draft bill and
the annual business plan. And I think we have to think about rail industry retailing as the shop window of the industry. And I think, to give a personal view, sometimes the industry is quite preoccupied with the civil engineering or the track and the signalling and the rolling stock and all of the operations and all of the things that go into making it happen. And curiously, it spends less time devoted to actually how do customers find and access and travel the services that are provided. So to answer the question, Mr. Newlands, yes, I think there should be a section on retailing in the annual business plan, and I think it would be helpful for the industry to set out what it wants out of retailing in terms of how customers are acquired and in which segments that they're acquired, and how those segments perform, and do they meet expectations, or where there is opportunity to fill surplus capacity, as Cameron has described. Because if the average load factor across the industry is something just in excess of 50%, then of course we have some trains that are very, very busy, and we all know that. But there is still plenty of opportunity to fill trains at different times using different price levers if those are available to retailers to do so.
And last question from me. There are some who might say that the commission, and obviously you guys would prefer if you had more flexibility with regard to commission in sort of different ways perhaps, but more commission. There were some would argue that commission, because we talk a lot about money going out potentially to overseas state owners of operators, etc., but that's more money going out of the system potentially for reinvestment to private companies. And I'm not a troglodyte, I'm a former business analyst, but obviously that is money that's potentially leaving the sector, and there's an argument to be made that perhaps the retailing side, much as, again, Trainline, other providers are available, but provide an excellent platform in that which I use regularly, but it's still the easy end of the rail market in terms of the operating a service is obviously tougher, requires more risk, etc. But yet potentially private sector are taking the easy money. I know you'll take offence potential to that, but taking the easy money out of the rail system as opposed to that money staying in if there was a GBR ticket seller. What would be your answer to that?
So I'm going to take it in two parts, if I may. One is the easy money. I think the train line that you're contemplating.
Quote on that easy money.
The easy money you refer to is the product now of kind of 20 years of investment, and of course it's not like some web pages on the front of a database, right? It's fraud expertise, it's payments expertise. You have to have banking grade infrastructure to take billions of pounds of the industry's revenue, right? That is, it's not easy. So that's the first part. The second part is the commission that's paid to retailers, and this concept that comes to the fore occasionally that somehow this is a tax on the industry, it's money leaching out of the industry, and it would be better staying in the industry, all comes from a place which supposes that retail that was done by the government or a state-owned provider is free. And of course it's not. Retailing always costs. Right? There's a payment provider, there is a developer, there's a user experience that has to be planned, there's fraud that has to be paid for, there's customer service. It all has to be paid for, and actually that it is done within the confines of a 5% or a 2% or a 4.5% commission construct is an extraordinarily cost-effective way of selling train tickets, and might I venture more cost-effective than many other retailers are able to provide it for in the rail industry currently.
Mr. Jones?
I concur with John. I think whenever there's empty seats on the train, then there's an opportunity to pay for the marketing of those seats. And I think the commission that's paid to the retailers goes a long way to try and fill those trains. I think there could be a more prescriptive approach or analytical approach to those commissions, as I touched on before, to make sure that you're allocating capital to where it needs to fill trains. But I think it's exactly as John said. Just direct distribution for a supplier is not free. That commission pays for customer acquisition costs, fraud costs, all the things that John mentioned as well, payment costs as well. So I think it's not easy money. It's not free money. It's certainly paid for the marketing of those trains. And until the trains are full, I think it's difficult to say that it's wasted money.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. I'll come to both of you, but can I come to you, John, first? What provisions specifically relating to ticketing would you like to see in any future legislation?
I think for us it's principally about the creation of the correct market structures going forwards. And so if we take as a starting assumption that the policy direction of travel from both the current administration and the opposition is that there will not be a centralised retailer, then the question arises, well, what form will the retail market take in the future? And I think we can speculate that train operators will continue to retail as they do now, perhaps in a slightly aggregated form, with fewer providers in the marketplace seems to be one direction of travel, and then there is the community of independent retailers. And I think for that market to function effectively, and we've already determined that it is a market of high value, right? So we're talking about the collection of 10 or 11 billion pounds worth of industry revenue, then it has to be orchestrated properly and regulated effectively. And I think the thing that we are most concerned about as we move into the future is the separation in regulation terms of licence givers and competitors. So at the moment, to return to the point I made at the start, Rail Delivery Group allocates licences, but Rail Delivery Group is also a member organisation, and that leads to this conflict of interest. So we would most of all like to see the legislation provide for structural separation between licence giver and competitor, and we would like to see provisions that ensure level playing field in the marketplace. That means that everybody who comes into the market can do so on equal terms, can compete equally, who benefit from access to the same fares, the same features, the same functions, and can serve customers equally, all in pursuit of the competition that we have been talking about this morning.
So if it wasn't obvious, first and foremost, there should be a centralised retailing solution. I think that the concept of continuing with 13 plus different websites for train operating companies just adds more confusion and incoherence to the marketplace. So aggregating that to a single retailer makes perfect sense, in my mind at least. I think we would like to see an end date for the CCST cardboard tickets, paper tickets. I think barcodes, a date for ubiquitous barcodes across the whole market, including across London, I think makes sense. I think there should be a provision for allowing retailing to happen outside of ticket stations in high street channels as well, where people buy tickets. And I think that there should be a way to hold the central system to account and benchmarked against innovation. How can we make sure that innovation happens quickly and is fast, and that the centralised body is held account for that continued investment and quick innovation process?
So I think you've just answered my next question was what do you think this excludes in terms of rail reform? And Cameron, I think you've answered that question, but John, is there anything to add to that?
Could you re-ask the question?
Anything that this excludes from rail reform that you'd like to see in the future? Aside
from provision for the frameworks of the way in which the market should operate, I mean, again, Cameron listed a whole variety of things that should be brought to the fore, all of which we would support. I think if the previous panel looked back to the 1993 Railways Act, and we look back to the network conditions that were in place at the time, and you had one ubiquitous token that was available, which was the orange magstripe ticket that could enable you to make any journey from anywhere to anywhere, including cross London, and to do so seamlessly. And the fragmentation in the rail industry over the last 20 or 30 years has, in some regards, inhibited that. So it is now not possible to make a journey from Seaham to Brighton without making a separate journey leg across London in a way that's entirely unhelpful and counterintuitive to customers. That is not to deny any of the achievements of what London has in terms of Oyster and pay-as-you-go, but that is a ticketing construct that is solely useful for a very, very discrete part of the rail network. And as the rail reform agenda steps forward, I think one of the things that concerns us most is that we don't invest further in geographically disparate islands that make coherent travel across the network important. And pay-as-you-go schemes have been announced in Manchester and in Birmingham, and they want to achieve the same things that have been achieved in in London. The mayor in Manchester talks about wanting London like pay-as-you-go. But the citizens of Greater Manchester also have to get to and from Greater Manchester, and people outside Manchester have to travel into Manchester, and that's all in the name of better economic mobility and serving the country better. And for Greater Manchester to only think about the needs of customers that exist in the Greater Manchester area means that something misses. And so the 1993 Railways Act made extensive provision for things like network benefits. It recognised that there was a desirable feature of a national network that enabled through ticketing, inter-availability and all of those sorts of things. And I think that that's quite an important principle that we should not lose as we go forwards.
I think that's one thing that Trainline does very well as well. It's the international travel that you can use through the app. So if we were to move to a centralised system through GBR, that would have to be a consideration as how we would look at the international travel, because right now Trainline does dominate with that, and it's very simple to do. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up at Zara's point and what you were saying about the devolved element, if I can put it that way, about how GBR will work alongside Transport Scotland, Transport Wales, the subnational transport bodies, the mayoral combined. Do you have any concerns beyond what you've just alluded to, how this construct of the industry will work from a ticketing perspective?
So clearly the construct of devolved powers has the effect of taking decision-making closer to the communities that the elected representatives are there to serve. And that is not our concern. Our concern is that if they make decisions that are parochial and narrow in their scope, that they have the effect of stopping customers making seamless journeys from one part of the country to another. And we have some important arteries in the East Coast Main Line and the West Coast Main Line. And there is no problem today, but there was a moment in time where LNER and Cross Country all wanted to adopt mobile barcode tickets, but ScotRail was not ready to accept them. And so you get to this kind of construct where greater fragmentation, disunified customer experience, and it just serves as an impediment to travel. And that's as important for Scotland as it is for people to England, because people need to move about. And the industry solved that because through tickets were the ones that were able to be sold as barcode tickets, and local tickets for a period of time weren't. But now Scotland is also barcode enabled, so the issue has gone away. But that's a good example of the sorts of things that we need to avoid with respect to local pay-as-you-go schemes, where they need to think about, they need to contemplate that people travel from beyond the boundaries that are served by those schemes. And retailers also need to be able to offer those products within those areas to facilitate travel on and off the islands onto the bridges that get them to other parts of the country.
Does there need to be anything on the face of the bill or in subsequent stages to ensure that cooperation and clarity?
And at this point, I would say, not being a legislative expert, I'm not sure exactly where it should sit, but I think some framework provision ought to be made for those constructs. Yes, I don't know whether it's primary legislation or secondary, but yes, I think it should be provided for.
Do you concur?
Not a lot more to add other than echoing John. I think the coordination between Wales and Scotland needs to be very close, so that the customers ultimately have a joined up experience between where they buy their tickets and where they use the tickets, and travelling across those territories.
Thank you. Got a couple of quick supplementaries from colleagues. Firstly, Carl, and then Fabian.
Thank you, Chairman. You just mentioned framework constructs within the bill. And you've just been talking now, both of you, about obviously ticket pricing and innovation and the way things might move forward. And John, you particularly mentioned that commuters, regular commuters, those who buy season tickets, haven't really come back in the numbers since the lockdowns that one would have hoped or expected. Mm-hmm. Do you think there should be provision in the bill to do that? And both of you, do you think with innovation, and we've seen with the potential of closing ticket offices, any organisation staffing is a cost, and probably one of the largest costs. Do you think that we'll actually see maybe incentives, or maybe the bill should have incentives for season tickets to be cheaper than they were, because over £1,000 a month is a lot for anybody. It's more than their mortgage probably for many people. But rather than it go in, that innovation providing profits for the companies, should it go in lower ticket prices to bring passengers back?
I think that ultimately the amount that is paid for train tickets is a matter for government policy, and in terms of the split between kind of what is provided by subsidy and what's provided through the fare box is a moot point, and has been one that's been at play in the rail industry for decades. I think the point I was making earlier is that you could do much more to encourage customers to be regular users of the network without necessarily having to discount prices significantly. So if I have a weekly, season tickets are weekly, monthly, odd period or annual, whatever they are, but it means that at the point of purchase, I've had to declare my hand. At that moment, I've had to declare my future intent for either a week or a month or 3 months or even a year in order to get the best discounts. And in this day and age, in the way people live and work and move, that just seems anachronistic. If you could benefit from the same discounts but over a longer period of time, and so you bought a month's worth of travel but over 3 months, the actual revenue benefit to the industry might be the same in overall terms, but the flexibility that's offered to the customer is much greater. And so it's always easy to say tickets should be cheaper and then more people would travel, and I think sometimes it's more nuanced than that. The product set would be more
something like a scratch card then with 30 journeys on that you could scratch off each one that you took over a 3-month period.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just off the top of my head, coming up with something
and a flexi season was the early attempt to provide that kind of capability, but it doesn't provide compellingly better capability than the previous offers to do so. And I think one of the benefits of digital retailing, and Cameron and I have talked about digital retailing, and of course we are advocates of it, is that it enables you to test things in a live environment with real customers really easily and without much in the way of consequence. And so in a future industry framework, we would welcome encouragement for different retailers or technologists to try different constructs. If they work, that's great, we'd do more of it. If it doesn't work, you turn it off. Now, one of the things I would point to is where we have been able to roll out digital season tickets on approximately half of the rail industry so far, we're seeing two really interesting phenomena occur. One is that uptake of season tickets is starting to improve, so that market is starting to come back. And then secondly, you have improved patterns of repeat purchase of other types of products. You get them in the habit of using the train, and lo and behold, they decide that they're going to use the train more frequently. And so those gentle nudges, those kind of behavioural changes, those applications of consumer technology to make people's lives better, lower barriers, ease accessibility, sometimes just do enough to get people to try the train and to stick with it.
So I would just add, I think travel behaviour has changed since COVID, and the concept of a season ticket is a reward for frequent use, a discount for frequent use. But as John said, it's structured so that you have to plan out your journeys for the week or the month or the year and decide what's the best option for you, and people will do those calculations. If you spin that on its head and you give people the confidence that they will be charged the best price, travel as much as they want, and then you look at retrospectively what they travelled and then apply the season ticket or the frequent traveller discount either as a pure discount and charge them post fact, or as a loyalty scheme, which could be run by a centralised organisation, then it's a little bit to your scratch card idea. It's the same thing. It's rewarding people for frequent use. And I think per John's point as well, the more you encourage people through pricing products, through pricing points or products to get on the train, then the more familiar they are with train, and then that becomes the catalyst for the whole industry to get back and travelling, and more people that come into the office encourages more people to come to the office for face-to-face meetings. So I think, exactly as John said, the nature of digital retailing allows you to trial these things. I think one of the challenges with RDG and some of the industry innovation is how long these trials last for before it's rolled out as a product. It could be 2 years for something to be in trial before it's rolled out more broadly. That needs to be much faster twitch, and these trials need to be reflective of other digital markets we see in other verticals where companies are trying and testing new products, pricing technologies daily, weekly, to see what customers respond to and what works. And that's the way we should be thinking about this as a digitally oriented, customer-facing marketplace.
Should we be thinking weeks or months at the most rather than years?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Thank you both indeed. Chairman.
And Fabian.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just on that point of season tickets and scratch cards, great idea by Carl there, but the French already have a system, the carnet. You buy 10 journeys in advance, and then you have a separate ticket or digital interface for each of those, and you use them when you need to use them rather than over a set period of time. Is that something that the industry is looking at and that this bill would enable?
It's another thing. It's another example of something that should be tested and tried. And if that works in a digital format, I don't think people want to carry around cards with them. And,
no.
As you implied, it's done digitally. Then try that. And if it works in this marketplace, then that should be rolled out. If it doesn't work, then you can pivot to something else. But the concept of discounting for frequent use is just a well-known pricing strategy across any industry, and it makes sense. But again, it comes back to how do we test these things and try them and see that if they're right for this marketplace.
They certainly work in other parts of Europe. The point I wanted to ask you though about was the move to digital technology, which I think the majority of us in this room would applaud and probably use ourselves every day, if not every week. But I wondered how you would deal with those excluded from digital technology, because there may be a small percentage of the travelling public, but they're nonetheless significant. How would you deal with people who don't carry a mobile phone or a smartphone or know how to use an iPad or a computer?
And this is a fact, and a critically important fact as well. The reality is there is a lot of people, the unbanked or people that don't have mobile phones, that want to be able to buy tickets in whichever channel they're used to buying tickets in. And that's why the importance of a centralised system that has a joined-up retailing approach, whether it be digital, web, mobile, voice, whatever the next channel is, or whether it be in a high street store or a ticket vending machine or a ticket office, it needs to be a single solution that allows people a consistent experience across all of those channels and doesn't leave anybody behind. And so that importantly, that you can get the best fares at the ticket vending machine or at your ticket office. It's the same access to fares as what you would find online. Eventually, if this market behaves like other markets in the world, in Sweden, for example, they don't have any ticket offices and 100% of their tickets are sold digitally. But that's happened over time, not as close the ticket offices and then hopefully people move digitally. Let's provide the solutions for them to move digitally first, and then let's ticket offices phase that as they need to, and when there's the appropriate channels for other people to buy in. But they shouldn't be left behind. All channels should be considered in this bill.
So the paper ticket isn't dead yet?
Not yet, but hopefully soon. Hopefully soon.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, and that concludes this panel. Can I thank you both again for your time and evidence to us this morning?
Thank you for yours as well.
Thank you.
Order.
Yes.
The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended. The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome to our third panel for today's session. For the purposes of our record, could I just ask you to state your name and organisation, please?
Good morning, I'm Robert Cook, I'm Policy Director at the Railway Industry Association.
Thank you. I should also point out we had hoped to be joined this morning by Malcolm Brown of Angel Trains, but for perfectly understandable personal reasons, he's not able to attend now, and we hope to reschedule a panel to talk about the rolling stock side at a later date. You represent the Rail Industry Association. Could you just talk us through what commitments you would like to see made, whether that's on the face of the bill or in supporting documents, for the new IRB to develop relationships with suppliers?
Thank you very much. So there are three sort of specific things we think we would like to see changed on the face of the bill, but maybe just to provide a bit of context about our overall views on the bill, which will help explain why we're asking for those three things. So over 50% of all expenditure on rail in the UK goes through the supply chain. So it's hugely important to get that right for value for passengers, taxpayers and freight. We've always supported rail reform. We want to see a bill brought forwards. We think the scrutiny process is also helpful. Partly it's that 6 years on from the May 2018 timetable changes, which triggered the Williams review, we really need certainty over industry structure. It's really important for businesses. But we also agree with Keith Williams's diagnoses and recommendations. So the importance of bringing integrated management of costs and revenues together in one place, removing the fragmentation we have between decisions being taken in the Department for Transport, in the Treasury and Network Rail, and the need for a guiding mind which is empowered but also made accountable to think in the interests of the whole system and for the long term. In terms of our members, they're a really diverse bunch of companies. So we have not just the physical railway but also the digital railway. We have very large companies, and we have 60% by number of our members are SMEs. The one thing that they all have in common is that if they are to invest in skills and innovation to bring efficiencies, what they need to see is that there is a clear and credible plan that they genuinely believe will be delivered. They need to have a long-term visible pipeline of work, and they need reasonable confidence that the rules of engagement for how they sell into the railway are stable, with no nasty surprises. So in that context, the three things that we would like to see tweaked on the face of the bill, and I do think they're quite simple changes. Firstly, a commitment to a long-term strategy for rail. We think that should be published. Secondly, strengthening some of the expectations around the IRB's licence to support transparency and investment confidence. And the third area is that we think the Secretary of State open-ended powers should be reconsidered, particularly the power of direction. I'm happy to unpack those in further questions.
Thank you. And in other sessions, we've raised concerns as a committee about the, we can put it this way, feast and famine nature of much of railway investment, whether that's in rolling stock procurement or electrification or other infrastructure development. Why do you think the bill needs to have that on its face to give that long-term certainty as opposed to just being part of the business plan?
I think the argument for a long-term strategy is accepted pretty universally across the sector. You know, we've got industry consensus, we've got political consensus. As you say, the question is, should it be on the face of the bill? I think, you know, it's been a number of years since Keith Williams has been clear that the railway has come to lack a single strategic direction. There have been repeat promises of a strategy being developed, and we still don't have one. So I think we're worried that unless there is a legal hook, we may never see one. It might not always be easy or politically convenient to sort of set out some of the difficult trade-offs that are inherent in setting out a proper, comprehensive strategy for the railway, but it's a helpful thing to do. I think there also is precedent potentially for putting it in legislation in that we do describe the planning framework for railway in legislation. We have the 5-year periodic reviews, which have been immensely helpful and do provide important stability and predictability for the railway. I think if you were to add on the requirement to publish a, say, 25, 30-year strategy and the requirement when you have a periodic review to check consistency with that strategy, it could really help you in providing long-term planning. And also, I mean, that could generate a lot of value for money benefits in terms of making good long-term decisions about things like electrification and checking that what you do in the next 5 years is still going to be valuable in 30 years' time, given that railway assets often last for decades.
In your sort of opening comments, you referred to a concern about the powers the Secretary of State will retain to intervene in the industry. How would you like to see, in terms of what's on the face of the bill, those powers constrained or clarity as to when they could be used?
So I think a general principle is that all open-ended powers to change the rules of the system potentially have some unintended consequences and carry some risk with them. You know, there may be appropriate powers. We do strongly support the importance that the integrated rail body is made accountable to the Secretary of State and to Parliament, so there's no question about that. And I think what it comes back to is some statements actually that have been very helpfully made by the Department for Transport, that it is the role of the integrated rail body to take the operational decisions and the role of the Secretary of State to set the strategic framework. And I think when that breaks down is when you start losing clear accountability. So the Department for Transport has been clear that the IRB would have operational day-to-day control. The Permanent Secretary has said that she's clear that it doesn't make sense for civil servants in London to be making decisions on operational matters. So I think there's consensus about that. In terms of the specific legislation, the way it's drafted at the moment seems to be a very open-ended power of direction. So it can be issued at any point in time. There's no requirement for consultation around this. And it's not just a power to be able to tell Great British Railways what to do, but it's drafted as a power to specify the manner in which it must exercise its functions. So I think there is a possibility that especially coming from a few years where the railway has had unprecedented levels of government decision-making for understandable reasons, you're creating a power here which potentially could be used to, it's almost like a magic button where you could ask, the Secretary of State could ask Great British Railways to do almost anything. So I think the argument would be either to remove that, because the Secretary of State has a lot of other powers, or to rescope it much more narrowly, based around specific areas where the Department for Transport can demonstrate that the Secretary of State may need to be able to intervene. And I would point out that the regulator has quite strong powers here, independently, to be able to intervene and issue enforcement notices. So there is a framework for specific intervention. The question is, why, if we didn't need these powers during the entirety of the COVID period, do we need them now?
We could just maybe cite a hypothetical example just to test where the boundary of intervention should lie. We all want to see greater electrification in the railways, and GBR comes up with a network plan to continue electrification. But the resources only allow one big project at a time, so there's a decision to be made on the sequencing. And let's say there's political lobbying from members of Parliament along the Chiltern line, and also lobbying from members of Parliament in Devon and Cornwall and Somerset. Is that an appropriate point for the Secretary of State to intervene and make that political choice over what the industry might think is the right answer?
There are inevitably clear political choices to be made. The question is, what's the right framework for taking those choices? So I would argue you should take those choices through the long-term strategy. You should take that choice through the periodic review process, which are transparent and open to consultation. The wrong way to take that choice would be to have an established list of projects and, without any announcement or consultation, to change the pecking order of those during the middle of a control period. And that could have quite a lot of unintended consequences, because you're pulling money away from some activity and putting it into others. So you have spill-on consequences over the integrated rail body's other activities, and then you're faced with the question, which parts of its performance is the integrated rail body still accountable for, and which parts of its performance is the Secretary of State accountable for? So no problem at all about making these political trade-offs, but it's about having them in the right framework.
That's helpful. Gavin, if you could.
Thank you very much, Chair. And in answer to Chair, you've covered an area that I was going to pursue. This may be a shorter session than we perhaps envisaged, particularly without Angel Trains being present as well. But you mentioned earlier about a more strategic approach and having the 25 to 30 year, or every 5 years having a 25 to 30 year review. So in what other ways would you think that the bill could be changed? You've obviously given your views on the Secretary of State's powers or potential powers as it currently stands, but in terms of that strategic approach, what other things do you think could be changed in the bill? And I'll circle back to that.
So I do think it is quite simple in terms of that long-term strategy. We just need a requirement that it should be published. I think our proposal would be that the Secretary of State should rightly set sort of overall priorities, a strategic remit. The integrated rail body will need to produce that because it will have the relevant expertise, and the Secretary of State would need to approve it. In terms of other changes in the bill, I think I mentioned strengthening expectations around the licence. So if you get the licence right, it can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you and help prevent you having a very unwieldy long bill. But it is important to have some hooks in the legislation that set up the licence well. So within the licence, in terms of having that longer term view, one of the things we think is absolutely essential is that there should be a transparency requirement for publishing what's the future pipeline of investment for the railway. And that would sit very well alongside a long-term strategy. So the government has committed in the past to publishing the rail network enhancements pipeline, showing what all the potential investments are going to be. Now, that was last updated 4.5 years ago, and it was supposed to be an annual publication. So we don't know why, but there's clearly difficulties with putting that information out. I think making it a legal requirement by having a hook saying that the licence has got to require it could be very helpful. You could also make it a more technocratic exercise where it's the responsibility of the rail body to set out that sort of information. So you'd have a 25 to 30 year strategy, you'd have an enhancements pipeline, and then you'd have 5-year plans. And the cumulative effect of that would be a lot more visibility and certainty for the supply chain. To give you an example, we recently took some of our members on a visit to Ireland. Other countries do set out pipelines. It's very clear there. They were setting out information on which projects have had funding approved, which projects have had business cases approved, and it's getting a lot of investment interest. So it's something I think we can do quite easily here.
Well, just on that, you mentioned Ireland, which can marry up a strategy along with the pipeline of funding potential as well. If I can be parochial for a second, clearly the chair referred earlier to a feast or a famine with regard to things like electrification. Clearly in Scotland there's the continuous electrification programme, there's a decarbonisation strategy, and there's overarching transport strategy and everything that feeds from it. So there's a clear strategy there and a clear programme that exists. What is missing is that pipeline element because of the negotiations for every control period that obviously currently exists. But that obviously operates within the current Network Rail arrangements, and we have a guiding mind as much as practicable because rail is, the network is still reserved to Westminster. There's still a guiding mind which has largely been copied in many ways for the draft legislation. In fact, we've lost our guiding mind to the DfT just in the last few weeks. But do you think that the draft bill and the introduction of GBR is a potential threat to any of that investment or that strategy as currently works under the current arrangements?
No, I don't, and I think it probably could support it by creating a body that is empowered to take that proper long-term view. And we're massive supporters of having that steady rolling programme of work, and that's not just because it benefits suppliers. It's what it does is it enables you to deliver things much more cheaply. There's lots of evidence that shows, if you have to stop and reskill an entire workforce because you've taken them off the job for a number of years, that's going to cost a lot of money and a lot of jobs. So there's a lot of benefit to having that sort of framework. The legislation obviously isn't about making decisions on what specific projects should go ahead within the railway, but it does create a framework, I think, that will enable a much more holistic view to be taken of the railway, both at a national level, at a range of national levels, at a UK level, and then through devolved administrations.
And last question from me, Chair, but if it were to be proven, I've heard argument that the arrangements that are currently proposed with regard to GBR versus the current kind of Network Rail arrangements with regard to Scotland may well actually remove potentially some of the powers that are currently open, or at least make them far more difficult. Would that be far more difficult for the Scottish Government to make those sort of plans, or Transport Scotland to make those plans? Would that be something that the RA would oppose if it were to hamper those efforts?
So I think as a trade association representing suppliers, we wouldn't have a view on what's the right balance of sort of political power. I think for our members, the key thing is that whoever's making the decisions, businesses have visibility over what work is happening and who to speak to about it. Who actually an understanding of who are the decision makers and when will that be set out. So from a business perspective, I think we're impartial on that. But we do want to make sure you've got that long-term plan and clarity over who's making what decisions.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And we've talked a bit about, obviously, government investment and also private investment. Obviously, in this country, we haven't seen huge amounts of private investment in the infrastructure, which compares with some other countries where we have seen much more. So in terms of those barriers, what else? You've talked about strategy and the lack of that strategic focus and plans for the future. What other barriers are there to attracting more of that private investment, particularly into things like infrastructure development?
It's a great question. I think we do feel, and across our membership, there is a sense that you could do much more here. I think, to be clear, we're talking about private funding, but also private finance, and also leveraging third-party funding. So, for example, several local authorities have money that they might be prepared to put into the railway if that was stable. I think one of the key lessons here is that it's been very complex to do, and there's no set way of doing it. We published a report last year looking at ways of boosting private investment into rail. And I think the key finding overall is that there's not a clear policy on how government expects this to be done. And the practical reality is you come up with a lot of bright ideas and proposals, but then as a scheme developer, you have to take them through so many different stages of approval, coordinate all the different stakeholders yourself. You have to sort of take them, get approval from the Department of Transport, and then you've got to get approval from the Treasury. If you flipped it on its head and government set out a really clear strategy and had a strategic view on what it wants to do with private investment on the railway, I think there's no reason why the government couldn't set out perhaps 3 or 4 overarching models and approaches to this, and then flip from being a gatekeeper into being a facilitator of actually, there are a set number of ways, whether it's a concession model, whether it's a public-private partnership, of being able to do this. But what you don't see is all the mechanics that you have to step through being set out neatly in one place. So again, I'd come back to the start with a clear strategy here, and then set out, actually, practically, if you're an investor or a developer, what are the things you have to do to bring the scheme together? And then I think the final bit of that is that you've got people within the public sector who are tasked and willing to help you on that journey. So there's a lot of complexity with developing anything around the railway, but I think we make it more complex than it needs to be.
Do you think there is resistance within parts of the department and also Network Rail to encouraging in more private investment into the railway?
What we've seen is not resistance, it's fragmentation. So everybody's got a different issue that they're having to look after, whether that's making sure that you've got the right sort of safety procedures in place quite rightly, or whether you're, another part of government will of course be looking at whether there's any impact on the government balance sheet position. What nobody is doing is joining up all of those pieces and getting everyone to say, if we want to leverage investment, these are all the things that have to work. And so you've not got any leadership around that. And then from a business perspective, trying to wade through all of that is very opaque and confusing. And I think that's the frustration. Not that anyone is actually trying to frustrate it. There's been lots of good statements about the importance of bringing it forwards. And there are clearly examples where if you look at what's possible around the station estate, for example, you can imagine bringing in private investment because of the possibility to develop housing or maybe car charging points and develop retail spaces. There's lots of opportunities there. But
in terms of that process, obviously there are also financial hurdles because Network Rail often charge an overage to anything that isn't within their spending programme. So do you think that is also problematic when it comes to encouraging more private investment?
We haven't heard a lot of specific problems about that issue for our members. I think it comes back to having a very clear playbook of how you do this, and on the face of it, what you're going to be charged, what the process is, how long it takes. That all should be set out, and it is complex to do, but there's no reason why we can't bring all that together in one place.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Open question, opportunity. Is there anything else that you'd like to put before us as we continue our scrutiny of the draft bill?
Thank you. So I think I've talked about the long-term strategy and the Secretary of State power of direction. There's probably just a couple of other small things around the licence worth mentioning. I think the Secretary of State has an open power to amend the licence, and that can be at any point in time. We think it's appropriate the Secretary of State can amend the licence. We have no concerns with that. But it's desirable for it to be linked to the 5-yearly periodic review process, because that gives a bit more stability about the framework that you're working in. If it was necessary to make changes outside of that 5-yearly process, and it might be, then I think we'd argue for slightly more safeguards around that. So perhaps a slightly longer consultation period, perhaps an opinion by the Office of Rail and Road as an independent regulator on what the impact of that might be on Great British Railways and the outcomes it's been tasked to deliver. So that's one small point. The other point is that within the licence, we think there should be an obligation here to promote a healthy and sustainable supply chain. So you've got the visibility obligation within the licence, but then you've also got a behavioural one and a cultural one. If you're thinking about the sort of culture of the organisation you're trying to provide, that's been discussed by a number of the panels. It's really important. It's responsive to its customers, but also works well with the supply chain. So we'd like to see that in there. We think a hook in the legislation that requires that to be in the licence, as has been argued for a number of different areas, would be a proportionate way to do that.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We're very grateful. It's a shorter panel than been envisaged, but it's been very helpful indeed to our work. So thank you again for your time.
Many thanks indeed.
Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.